when I think about American history, and I hate to admit it, but I think about American history all the time, pretty much, being a history nerd. There are just certain decades in our history that are so critical. I think of the 1770s, of course, with the beginning of the Revolution. I actually think of the end of the 1780s because we're writing our Constitution. We're trying to figure out, now that we've won independence, who are we and how are we going to govern ourselves? And then there's a lot that goes on in the early 19th century, but a portion of the 1820s and the 1830s, especially the Jackson presidency and the expansion of the Democratic vote and everything, becomes a real issue. And then we come to the 1850s. And I will tell you that later on, in probably the fall, we'll be looking at the 1940s, because if there is a period of time in history where so much happens in literally less than a year, it is when Harry Truman comes to the presidency. And there's so much that just ramps up and happens so quickly. But I wanted us to talk today about the 1850s, and we have talked about it in certain ways earlier in different sorts of segues, talking about sectionalism, talking about the build up to the American Civil War. But I honestly think that we can't talk about the 1850s too much. So I'm going to try and run through it all. I tend to think of the 1850s as that period, and Garth Brooks is probably going to sue me, but when the thunder begins to roll, and you just have this increasing conflict between ideologies, between sections, between how we envision this republic should actually come to be. And it hits sort of a high point in 1850, and we're going to look at some of the most critical dates. And I'm going to try and move real quickly, because we all know that I tend to get too deep in the weeds sometimes, because it's so fascinating how things come into being. And in that 10-year period, that decade, we go from the possibility that we might be able to avert war, maybe kind of, hopefully, and we have sort of this, it's almost like cold fronts and hot fronts hitting each other. We have a whole series of powerless presidents. We have Henry Clay, who dies, who's the great compromiser, and he's not there to fix stuff. Even though Clay sometimes fixes stuff and makes it worse, he at least was trying to fix stuff. And then we've got that compelled by westward expansion, and what are we going to do with the future? So I'm going to kind of walk you through what I think are critical events that occur in the 1850s, things that, when we talked about them, probably when we were in high school, I don't know that I had any understanding of cause and effect the way that I do as an old person, having just had a piece of cake and knowing what the effect of that is going to be. But, cause and effect, when you're a teenager, you just don't tend to think of those sorts of things. So let's kind of walk through the 1850s, talk about the major events that occur then. And the very first slide that I have up for you, or that Christine will have up for you, is the Compromise of 1850. And that's the way that we begin this decade. So you'll see, and I used this when I first started out with a map, and I thought, let's use this, because sometimes events in history are of such magnitude that the only way that you can really deal with them is to sort of look at them in humor and in hindsight. So you'll see in this one, Uncle Sam, who is sitting there, the whole idea of government, sitting there on the map, and he's saying, I just can't keep doing this forever. And that tells us a little bit about what the Compromise of 1850 is going to be. Now, I referenced it last week when we were talking about those powerless presidents, but I'm going to hit it again with a couple of things that are really important. So 1850s, we come out of the Mexican War, we're gaining territory. What are we going to do with that territory? We had decided in the Missouri Compromise in 1820 that 3630, we were going to draw a line all the way across the United States, even though a lot of that territory we didn't actually have control of. We knew it was coming to us eventually, because Manifest Destiny told us that it was ours. We were here to be the force that would bring democracy and freedom and all of those sorts of things all across the continent, that it had been given to us by God, and it was our responsibility to make good use of it. 3630 all the way across. until it's not. So in the Compromise of 1850, which really is made up of 5 separate bills, and they originally had all of them lumped together, and they realized when they got on the floor of the House for debate that it just was not going to work that way, that they had to peel it out and deal with one issue at a time. And that's probably one of those life lessons that we all know, is that you need to keep it simple. Let's do one thing at a time, one day at a time. For those of us that have had difficult periods in our life, sometimes one day's all you can deal with. So what are we going to do about those new territories, and how are we going to do it? So the Compromise of 1850 is the mastermind of Henry Clay. Now, Henry Clay had been the mastermind of the Compromise, the Missouri Compromise, in 1820, 30 years earlier. Henry Clay has been this compromising member of the U.S. Senate and the House forever. So Henry Clay is in the House, Stephen Douglass is in the Senate, and they put together this series of pieces of legislation that will be the Compromise of 1850. Now, it's important to remember that Andrew Jackson's vice president during that first term in office had been John C. Calhoun, who had become, he and Jackson have this knockdown, drag out, not actually physically, but with words, fight, almost came to fisticuffs. And Calhoun had resigned from the vice presidency, gone home to South Carolina, and was almost immediately appointed as the U.S. Senator from South Carolina. That was in 1832. John C. Calhoun in 1850 is still in the U.S. Senate. And Calhoun, his driving mission is that there should be an expansion of slavery into the new territories. But, he's sort of trying to find a line to walk, hoping that he can help get things done. In a speech in 1850 to the Senate, he says, and I'm going to quote him here, "I have, senators, believed from the first that the agitation on the subject of slavery would, if not prevented by some timely and effective measure, end up in disunion." So he's saying in 1850, if we can't figure out a compromise on all of this, there's going to be a disunion. There will be a nullification. We're going to be facing war. And of course, this is not the first time that he's mentioned that. He had mentioned nullification as early as 1828. So he's pushing for the Compromise of 1850 because it includes the concept of popular sovereignty, which would be, instead of the federal government having imposed where that line would be, 3630, it would allow the people who are in those areas to make decisions of their own. So basically, what the Compromise of 1850 said was it prohibited slavery in Washington, D.C., the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but you could have slaves if you lived in Washington, D.C. You just can't have buying and selling slave markets in D.C. It added California to the Union as a free state. It establishes Utah and New Mexico, you'll see down in the lower left-hand corner of the map. It establishes them as territories that will decide because of popular sovereignty. They will vote as to whether or not they'll have slavery. It defined the boundaries of Texas, and Texas gets some money for giving up a little bit of the land that will go to New Mexico. And then the final and one of the most controversial parts of it, of course, was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And that required citizens in the North to assist in apprehending runaway slaves, and it denied enslaved people the right to a trial by jury. That's two really important points. So, Compromise of 1850, there is a belief on the part of Henry Clay, Stephen A. Douglass, who's the father of popular sovereignty, and even John C. Calhoun, who in his ideal world, all of the rest of U.S. territory would have been open to slavery, but he's willing to compromise to avert war. So Compromise of 1850 passes. Well, it passes in January. And on July the 9th of that year, Zachary Taylor dies. Now, Zachary Taylor, who had been, one of the two great war heroes of the Mexican War, he's old, rough and ready, versus Winfield Scott, who's old, fuss and feathers, kind of tells you about their uniforms and how they dress. Zachary Taylor dies in office, and Vice President Millard Fillmore becomes the president. And as we talked last week, Millard Fillmore, bless his sweet little heart, just was not ready for all of this. So we are without a strong voice in the executive branch. 1851 rolls around and everyone's trying to figure out how the Compromise of 1850 is going to be handled. And you'll remember that I mentioned the fugitive slave law was one of the ones that was most emotional, most volatile. So on September the 11th, 1851, interesting date there, and what will become known as the Christiana riots, you have a Maryland slave catcher who is killed while he attempts to capture a runaway slave in rural Pennsylvania. So he has left Maryland, gone into Pennsylvania, is attempting to capture this runaway slave when members of the community rise up and just kill him. And that sort of signals to those who are involved in the job as basically bounty hunters of capturing those runaway slaves that this is not an easy job. This is not, it may be the law that those in those northern territories, those northern states have to support the recapture of runaway slaves, but it being the law doesn't make it the truth. So the alarm goes out. Now, 1852, our next slide, I think you're probably going to recognize, because in March of 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe, who had never been south of Ohio, publishes what is probably the most famous book that is released during the 1850s, and it's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin depicts what slave life is like in the South, and it includes, for those of you that have read it or have seen it in play or anything, it depicts basically, the chasing of fugitives with the hounds. This depiction of Uncle Tom, who is attempting to sort of bring peace to everybody. There's this whole little Eliza ascending into heaven on the wings of angels as she is killed. I mean, it is this emotionally gripping portrayal of slavery in the South. You'll notice the copy that I pulled for you to look at is a copy. I was trying to see the date because I think when I pulled it, this was a copy of the cover of the book in 1854. So 2 years after it's published. And notice 305 copies have already been sold in the US. Now it's sold in Europe also, because you may remember that the Brits had outlawed any sort of slavery in 1832 as part of the Reform Bill of 32. The French have not yet, but they will shortly. So the issue of slavery is an issue on both sides of the Atlantic, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's depiction is just emotionally gripping. So much so that when Lincoln becomes president, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, along with the other famous members of her family, religious leaders, and everything, is invited to the White House, there's this wonderful depiction of tiny little Harriet Beecher Stowe, a rather petite woman, and Abraham Lincoln bending over to greet her and says, this is the little bitty woman who started the great big war. Gives you an idea of the impact of the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Well, now that's on March the 20th. In June of 1852, you have Henry Clay dying. And, it's interesting. Henry Clay is from Kentucky, and he dies after this long and distinguished career in the US Congress, always wanted to be president, tried so hard to be president several times, but just couldn't seem to pull it all together. But even those who didn't love him respected what he had been able to do. So his body will be taken from Washington, D.C. to his home in Kentucky. There will be really elaborate funeral observations in every city that they pass through. His body will lay in state in D.C., then they'll take him to the train station, and then every major town that he passes through on the way to Kentucky, they stop and have a service in their largest church. So this is a guy that, the power of being able to get people to talk to each other from different sides of the aisle. And Kentucky is the ideal place to do it because even as we will see during the American Civil War, Kentucky is that border state that's part free, part slave. Later that year, following Henry Clay's death, on the 4th of July, Frederick Douglass, and our next slide will show you that, Frederick Douglass is asked, and sort of an interesting thing, to come home. He was, his permanent residency at that point is in Rochester, New York, and he is invited to come home and speak to the citizenry of Rochester, New York. It is the 76th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, that's kind of a cool connection. You know, 1776 is the 76th anniversary. Frederick Douglass is at this point probably the most famous free man of color. He's this articulate spokesman. He is this well-written. He does his biography, and he comes home asked to help celebrate the 4th of July. And he delivers this speech. It's a fascinating speech. I'd love for you sometime when you have time, Google it. It's a long speech. Delivering it took almost an hour. You know, audiences obviously paid attention better back then because, you know, my poor pastor, if he goes, when it gets close to noon, people start looking at their watches. But Frederick Douglass is going to speak for almost an hour. And I'll let you read it, but I did want to read you a couple of excerpts from it because it's a fascinating speech. He is a lover of this country. He says he's a lover of this country, but he's sort of perplexed as to why they would ask him, a man who is not considered to be a citizen, a man who does not have the right to vote in most places in the nation, to come. So let me read you a couple of excerpts from his speech. It just absolutely is a fascinating speech. He talks for 15 or 20 minutes, and then he says, this, for the purpose of the celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and of your political freedom. This is to you, and remember, he's a great man of faith. He says, this is to you what Passover is to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to that day and to the act of your great deliverance and to the signs and the wonders associated with that act in that day. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and reminds you that the Republic is 76 years old. Now, he's going to pay homage first to the signers. He says, the signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men, great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not happen often to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point from which I am compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with anything less than admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, and heroes, and for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you in honoring their memory. Then he pauses. But what to the American slave is the 4th of July? And he pauses again and he says, I answer, it is a day that reveals to him more than all of the other days in the year, the gross injustice and the cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Whoa. Frederick Douglass's speech will be carried in newspapers across the nation because this is a man who very carefully balances talking about this great dream of the Republic, the vision of the founding fathers. And he will go on in the speech to say, but they didn't deal with all of the people who lived within those colonies. They didn't deal with the future of all the people who lived within the nation. it gets a tremendous amount of attention, and it will be quoted so often by the abolitionists during this period, 1852 all the way until 1860. So Frederick Douglass becomes sort of this touchstone, this spokesperson for those free Blacks who do not have full citizens' rights, but also for those who are enslaved. Now, if the year hasn't been difficult enough, we've lost Henry Clay, we lost Zachary Taylor, we lost Henry Clay. You know, we get to October the 24th of that year, and Daniel Webster, who is always partnered with Clay in the compromises, Daniel Webster dies. And, you know, Congress is sort of reeling because here are these great men who have been able to make people work together, and they're both gone in a short period of time. Not only that, but Millard Fillmore is not going to be reelected as president, and Franklin Pierce, really good hair, not really good president, is elected president of the United States, and he will be sworn in 1853. Now, 1853, the big thing that happens then is the Gadsden's Purchase, which is the next slide. And you will see the Gadsden Purchase is signed on December the 30th of 1853. Now, it's roughly, it's not a huge territory, it's 30,000 square miles, give or take a little bit. Currently today, a little bit of southwestern New Mexico and a pretty good sized chunk of southern Arizona. And it's acquired by a treaty that will be signed by James Gadsden, who is our ambassador to Mexico. And Franklin Pierce will sign the treaty once the Senate always has treaty approval. Once the Senate approves it, Franklin Pierce signs it. And it's a significant purchase because there was talk at that point of running the railroad, a continental railroad, east-west, across the southern part of the United States. And they needed to be south of Phoenix because of the mountain ranges that went from Phoenix all the way north to the Canadian border. We'll find later that that's not, of course, where the railroad's going to go because they don't want the railroad in Southern Territory. So we go to our next slide, and we will see that in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is signed into law, and its purpose, by allowing sovereignty, popular sovereignty, you'll see, you know, what the Kansas Territory there is on the map, and then you see the magnitude of the Nebraska Territory. It goes all the way to the Canadian border. You see the Minnesota Territory, and there is this question, okay, so Minnesota, Iowa, those territories had come in under the Missouri Compromise. Notice Minnesota is 1849, Iowa is 1846. Missouri, of course, had been the linchpin in that Missouri Compromise of 1820. Well, here's this huge chunk of land. What are they going to do with it? So they begin to talk about how they're going to organize these new Western territories. This is part of the land that they had gotten after the Mexican War. And, you know, we've already had to deal with the rush of new people to California because of the gold rush and everything. So Stephen A. Douglas, who is the primary push person behind the Kansas-Nebraska Act, he is the father of popular sovereignty, begins to work in Congress and in particularly in the Senate for a northern route for the railroads, with Chicago being that hub for all the railroads going west. I think most all of us know that Stephen A. Douglas got his wish, because even today, Chicago is the hub for all of those major railroads, and also even for the airways that we have to deal with. So he wants the railroad to go through these territories, but he really is concerned about the issue of slavery. And he knows that he will not be able to get votes for the railroad to go through the northern territories instead of that southern route through Gadsden Purchase unless he gives something to the South. The South is not going to agree to his bill. So in 1854, he introduces what he says is a middle ground bill. And he calls on the names of Clay and Webster as he's doing it. And he says that we are going to organize the territories, quote, with or without slavery as their constitutions may prescribe. that concept of popular sovereignty basically would say that when they had accumulated enough population to begin to apply for statehood following the guidelines of the Constitution, that they would then, in their own state constitutions, choose whether or not they were going to be slaves. It's kind of interesting. He will later admit that he knew it probably, in his words, was going to raise a hell of a storm, but he didn't foresee, and he said later he did not foresee that it would probably be the single most important piece of legislation that would ultimately lead to the South seceding from the Union because of how it will play out. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So that same year, 1854, the Republican Party is created. So the next slide kind of shows you the birthplace of the Republican Party. So the birthplace of the Republican Party is in Wisconsin. And the Republican Party grows out of the old Whig Party. The Democratic Party at that point, the party of Jackson, has begun to splinter. There are the Northern Democrats, there are the Southern Democrats, there are the Copperhead Democrats, there are the Free Soil Democrats. And you have this new group of people who are concerned about the issues of slavery. They are concerned about territorial expansion and everything, and they craft a new party, and they will choose for that party the name of the Republican Party. When they meet in Wisconsin, they have about 10,000 people who also will meet in Michigan. And then later in 1856, they're going to meet in Pittsburgh, and they will nominate their very first presidential candidate in 1856. It'll be John C. Fremont, the great pathfinder, the hero of California, exploration, the mountain man from the Rockies. And they get a ringing endorsement from the abolitionists because of the position that they take up on abolition. Horace Greeley in particular will write, lots and lots and lots of editorials supporting the Republican Party of the 1850s as it's being created. Now, so the party is created, and 1855 rolls around. And in 1855, we're going to have Bleeding Kansas, which is the next slide. And I pulled this painting because it's a huge mural that today is on the walls of the house, the governor's house, the state capitol in Kansas. And it is absolutely amazing. I mean, it is a huge work of art. The person you see there is John Brown. My poor children, one summer as we were headed west, we diverted our path and drove all the way across Kansas so that they could see this painting, which, I wanted them to get a sense of how John Brown is depicted in this. Well, 1855, you've got Kansas-Nebraska Act passed in 1854. By 1855, you have this rush of settlers into the new territories. You have settlers from the north coming in, but you have a lot of settlers from the south coming in because that Kansas and Nebraska territory, it's plains. It's this wonderful, fertile earth that is ideal for agriculture. Now, Illinois and Indiana are agrarian states. And so you've got expansion westward from there, but you have a tremendous amount of expansion coming in from the south. So we end up with a situation where, as they're beginning to think about writing the Constitution in Kansas, you have this violent outbreak of guerrilla warfare between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces as the new territory is being created. In all, 55 people are killed between 1855 and 1859, which doesn't sound like a lot of people, but if you take into consideration the number of people who are going to be wounded or who are going to be attacked, and the amount of press that Bleeding Kansas gets, it becomes a national issue of major concern. So you think about that struggle that's intensifying because they're debating the future of slavery and the future of slavery in the United States, because as each new state comes in, of course, they have members in the House, but the Senate is incredibly important. The Senate, as it is conceived in the US Constitution, the Senate is sort of the cooling off place. You know, you have lots of speeches and agitation and everything that happens on the floor of the House of Representatives, but it gets to the Senate. Each state has 2 senators, and it's supposedly the period where cooler minds will be in control, and they will, with a greater understanding, because most senators serve for a long period of time, they will understand the consequences of what they're doing. Well, in March of 1855, when elections take place for the first territorial legislature, you have armed, and the newspapers call them ruffians, armed ruffians show up in Kansas again. And there's this whole question of there are lots of illegal votes cast. Lots of illegal votes cast. They don't have a good way of controlling who's voting at the polls. Are they truly residents of Kansas? Are they not? There also is this issue of intimidation. People come in to vote, and outside the voting precincts are these armed people, armed men, these ruffians who basically say, how much do you value your family? How much do you value your land? You're not going to vote anti-slavery, are you? And I mean, it's very well documented, this idea of force and this intimidation. And it really creates a problem, because what they end up with is when the votes are counted as they're putting together this first legislature, they have a slate of pro-slavery legislators. Well, the Northerners, who have a vested interest in what's going on in Kansas, along with the anti-slavery settlers that are there, refuse to accept the government. They say this is not a legal vote. It is a vote that has been tampered with, and they turn around and set up their own government. So in effect, in Kansas, you have a pro-slavery government, legislators elect a governor, and a anti-slavery legislature, and they elect their own governor. Now, there's no way that's going to work. Obviously, that's not going to work. So what you have happen is that once they set them up, those who are opposed to the idea that that original vote of slaveholders is a legitimate vote, you have a lot of people who are going to be called jayhawkers, who are going to come in, and they prepare themselves basically for clashes with the pro-slavery forces. Out of this will grow some of what we will hear of Quantrell's raiders during the Civil War. As tensions increase, Franklin Pierce decides that he will recognize the pro-slavery legislature in Kansas, but it's a little bit too late. And as a side note, you know, it's interesting when we look percentage of population of casualties during the American Civil War, the state with the highest number of deaths per capita of casualties, fatal casualties during the American Civil War, it will occur in Kansas. So, and it's all related to the issue of slavery. I mean, it's kind of fascinating when you think about it, because you tend to think, well, it would be Virginia, or it would, who has the most battles, or Tennessee, second most battles, but it's Kansas because of the lawlessness that will occur with guerrilla warfare. This picture depicts John Brown, and the reason that it depicts John Brown is because of something that will happen the following year, but just sort of, you know, to lead you into that, in May of 1856, John Brown, who is an abolitionist, who is a lay minister, and his followers will perpetuate what is known in history as the Pottawattamie Massacre, easier to read than say, that occurs in Kansas. And it occurs on May the 24th in 1856. And it's when John Brown 5 of his sons, and 3 other associates basically attack the cabins along this creek, and they murder all of the pro-slavery men. Brown had become upset because of something that had happened 2 days earlier in the US Congress, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. But he decided that while the scriptures say, "Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord," that the Lord also expected those men of God to work good against evil, and he will justify the rampage that he is now going to lead for the next 3 years, in which he is going to constantly be attacking pro-slavery forces. He will justify it using the Old Testament. And you will see in the picture here, which is fascinating, you also see the whirlwind in the back. He's referencing the scripture in the Old Testament talking about, the whirlwind. You'll notice that he has in his left hand the Bible. He has in his right hand the rifle. And he believes that one has to use both ways of fighting evil. I mean, this has become just a really recognizable painting, but I just think there's so much drama in there that it would be fun to just spend time, because in the background, of course, the painting occurs after the Civil War, but in the background, you see the Union flag on one side, you see the Confederate battle flag on the other side. Now, what had happened in Congress 2 days earlier that made John Brown, his sons, and several of his followers just kill these pro-slavery outspoken members there in Lane, Kansas? That was because on May the 22nd of 1856, there had been an argument that occurred in Congress. Now, interestingly, we watch things that happen in Congress sometimes now, and you listen to the speeches and you think, whoa, that's a little outspoken. But the truth of the matter is the US Congress, House of Representatives and Senate, both have always been sort of models for the rest of the world. If you ever tune in on Sunday nights to the Prime Minister's, the Prime Minister of Great Britain does a Sunday night broadcast that you can catch on BBC, and you can sometimes catch it on public television. And you look at the way they do things there, I mean, it's just hilarious. We tend to say, the honorable senator from the state of South Carolina, and then you may go ahead and just say all manner of evil about their positions, but we're very courteous. We don't physically normally attack each other. If you watch Japanese parliament sometimes, I mean, they physically just wail the daylights out of each other. That had not ever happened in the US Congress until May the 22nd of 1856, when you have Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, who gets up and makes this speech on the Senate floor in which he is basically outlining why the nation cannot continue to be divided on the issue of slavery, why slavery is inherently wrong. He's an abolitionist, and why the Senate has to come together to abolish slavery and bring the nation back together. Well, when he does that, Representative Preston Brooks, House of Representatives from South Carolina, hears that Sumner is on the floor of the Senate making this speech, and Brooks burst into the US Senate, and he will proceed with his cane to beat Senator Sumner about the head and shoulders, so much so that he almost kills Sumner. I mean, it's a vicious attack, but it's interesting in the press. Of course, the Northern press is just appalled that a member of the House of Representatives would leave his chambers, come into the Senate, and proceed to beat a duly elected and seated member of the Senate. The Southerners see that, they believe that Preston Brooks is justified because Sumner was making an attack against all slaveholding states, and he is declared a hero in the pro-slavery states. And this shows you how petty politics is sometimes. In the process of almost beating Senator Sumner to death, Brooks broke his cane across Sumner's head. And the Southern states took up a collection to buy him a new cane with a gold tip on the handle and on the tip of the cane itself. that he could carry in place of the one that he had splintered. So, things are heating up. It's 1856. Well, Franklin, as you'll remember, Millard Fillmore will be nominated by the Know Nothing Party, a new party. Franklin Pierce will be nominated by his party. James Buchanan will be nominated. And in November of 1856, James Buchanan is elected president of the United States and proceeds to basically do nothing but sit kind of in Washington for 4 years saying, I am, as the chief executive officer, I am here only to do what Congress tells me to do. It is not my place to have any opinion in any of the issues that are confronting this nation. I am an administrator. Well, he's not administrating a whole lot. So 1857, we come to probably the most significant Supreme Court decision since the Marshall Court, since John Marshall had died in the 1830s. And, Marshall had Madison versus Marbury. He'd had the Davenport decision, New Hampshire. I mean, there were so many, Madison versus Marbury. All of those cases have been so significant that in 1857, and early in the year, the court renders a decision that's called the Dred Scott decision. You'll see here in the slide on the left is Chief Justice Roger Taney. And Taney is how it actually was pronounced in the South, but he's the Chief Justice. He is originally from Kentucky. He, we know, was a pro-slavery justice. It's kind of interesting. And on the right, you see a picture of Dred Scott. Now, the story, and I'll do it real quickly, but the story is Dred Scott had been a slave that had been owned by John Emerson, who lived in Missouri. So John Emerson is attached to the U.S. military. He is an officer in the military. Well, as a part of his serving in the military, he took Dred Scott from Missouri, which is a slave state, but he took him into Illinois, which is a free state. And then he took him into Wisconsin, which was also a free territory. And during that period, Dred Scott meets and marries his wife, and they are part of the Emerson household. Well, Emerson and his wife will return to Missouri in the early 1840s, and Emerson dies in 1843. So before Emerson had died, and then after Emerson dies, Dred Scott tries to purchase his freedom from the Emerson family, and Mrs. Emerson refuses to allow him to buy his freedom. In 1846, he and his wife file lawsuits in Missouri. Now, think about how long this is going to take to get through the courts. But in 1846, they file lawsuits in the Missouri court, basically saying they left Missouri, they were in Illinois, they were in Wisconsin for a period of years. Therefore, because they were taken into free territory, they should no longer be considered to be slaves. Mrs. Scott's decision is sort of rolled into Dred Scott's, and it basically becomes the Dred Scott case because his is the greater argument. Part of that is because he's male, and the assumption was the courts might look more favorably upon this man of color who is a man who can read and write, who had been treated as part of the household, but had lived for this period of time in the free states. So it takes years for the decision to be rendered. So in 1850, the first step after this case that has been filed in 1846, Missouri comes back and says Scott is free. The state court does. But then the Missouri Supreme Court, 2 years later, 1852, comes back and says, Missouri has this sort of unwritten law that says once free, always free, but there's no constitutional grounds for that to be true. So the Missouri Supreme Court comes back and says, no, Dred Scott is not free. Now, Mrs. Emerson leaves Missouri, moves to New York. And at that point, then the case really becomes she's going to move in with her brother. She leaves her estate to her brother, John Sanford. It's not really Stanford, but Sanford. And so anyway, it's going to, Dred Scott's attorneys are going to appeal it to the U.S. District Court, and it'll eventually reach the U.S. Supreme Court. So Chief Justice Roger Taney's opinion in the court, most constitutional scholars, constitutional historians, but constitutional attorneys say it's probably the worst decision he ever wrote. He actually wrote a couple of decisions that were not bad, but this one stinks. He ignores precedent. He distorts the history of the situation. He imposes a very rigid way of constructing the Constitution, which was not what he had historically done. He ignores specific things within the US Constitution, and he just sort of writes this decision to get the answer that he wants to get, which is, of course, what judges are never supposed to do, and certainly not US Supreme Court judges. So what is his argument? He argues that state citizenship has nothing to do with national citizens, and that African-American citizens, while they might be citizens of a state, are not citizens of the United States. Which, you know, I will have to tell you, as a constitutional historian, I just always find to be, I don't know where the precedent for that comes. But anyway, Taney is standing on really shaky constitutional grounds because the Constitution has a clause that basically says judicial power shall extend among all things to, and this is a quote, compromises between citizens of different states. Well, there were a number of states in which Blacks were seen as citizens and had been allowed to vote in federal elections, and things of that nature were considered to be citizens. But Taney will just basically pretend that doesn't exist. So he really wanted a judicial solution on this, and he thought if he imposed a really strict judicial solution, it would end the question of slavery, the right of slave owners to have slaves, and the right of abolitionists to be arguing against slavery. Then it really would become a states' rights sort of decision. So Taney says, basically, his solution is Scott had never been free. So while he was living in Illinois, while he was living in Wisconsin, he was still a slave of the family, and they treated him as thus. He had never really been considered to be a free man at that point. And he then comes back and, using the idea of judicial review, says, you know, the Missouri Compromise that was enacted in 1820, which drew this line that basically was going to say it would forbid slavery north of the 3630 line. He says the US Senate, Congress didn't have the right, House or Senate in particular, did not have the right to enact that piece of legislation, because nowhere in the Constitution are they given the authority to forbid or abolish slavery. And he says, therefore, we have been acting under an illegal interpretation of the Constitution now for 37 years. Well, I mean, you talk about it hitting the fan, because this huge issue now, so no one is free. Congress has acted out of its boundaries. We can't draw lines. Well, we've been drawing lines now since 1820. So did, you know, the Compromise of 1850. So Taney has just created a firestorm, and it's only going to get worse. Now, in 1858, you have elections in Illinois in which you're going to have Stephen A. Douglas, U.S. Senate, and Abraham Lincoln, who is running on the Republican ticket for U.S. Senate. They're going to engage in a series of debates, and reading their speeches is absolutely fascinating. But what you basically have is Douglas saying popular sovereignty, Lincoln questioning what he believes to be the wrongness of slavery. He talks about the Union is most important, but that it's hard for him to believe that the issue of slavery is an issue that can be sanctioned by anyone. Well, ultimately, Stephen A. Douglas wins the election, but Abraham Lincoln will come to the attention of a lot of those people who are looking for a national candidate, which takes us to the next slide, which is John Brown is back. John Brown begins to realize with the Harpers Ferry raid, and I'm assuming some of you probably have been to Harpers Ferry at some point, but you go to Harpers Ferry and it's this, I mean, you go down into this, between the mountains, you go down to the river, and I can remember thinking the first time I was there, why Harpers Ferry? Well, you have John Brown bringing the abolitionist campaign back to the east, where he believes the decision is really going to be rendered here. And why Harpers Ferry? Because Harpers Ferry is an armory. It is where Virginia, at that point, stores its weapons, its gunpowder, its cannons, its munitions. It is what Brown believes, if he can capture the arsenal, if he can arm his followers, that they will then be able to ferment a uprising among enslaved people, and they will begin to put an end to the issue of slavery, because they will wage war against those who are supporting slavery. And he sees Virginia as the linchpin, with South Carolina to be where he would follow with the uprising, the slave uprising. He looks at the number of enslaved people in the South versus the number of free people and realizes there's a possibility of tipping the power with an armed revolution. Well, it doesn't really work out the way that he's planned it. Yes, he is able to launch a raid against the arsenal at Harpers Ferry, but his raid ends up in a disaster. He and so many of his followers will be taken prisoner by federal troops. Interestingly, the federal troops will be summoned and sent to Harpers Ferry under the command of, at this point, a colonel who had earned his stripes in the Mexican War as an engineer, and that colonel's name is Robert E. Lee. It is Robert E. Lee who will lead the federal forces against John Brown at Harpers Ferry, and Brown and his followers will be arrested. There will be a long and very publicized trial in which John Brown will ultimately be hanged for treason. Now, his death energizes a lot of people in the North who may not have agreed with the idea of an armed insurrection, but they see him as a man of God who was willing to allow himself to become a martyr for the cause of freedom for those enslaved people. In the North, when the announcement came out that John Brown had been executed, church bells chimed across many of those northern states. Interestingly, in the South, the church bells chimed too, but it was to call together the people to celebrate the fact that John Brown had been martyred. Final side note as we talk about that, because of how this occurs, in the North, they will realize that one of the ways that you get people actively involved in political issues is you bring them in with art, you bring them in with music. And so you will have drafted a song that some of you may remember from your childhood days of John Brown's body lies a molding in the grave. John Brown's body lies a molding in the grave, but his truth goes marching on, is how ultimately the song will end. So we are at 4:20, I can't see the time, but it looks like maybe 4:21 or 27 from my distance. One final slide. So instead of the 1850s having been that decade of compromise, that decade of bringing these forces together that are so divided over issues of westward expansion and slavery and the future of the nation, what we now have is the storm clouds have erupted into lightning strikes that have occurred, whether it was in Bleeding, Kansas, or it has occurred in the US Supreme Court with the Dred Scott decision, or it is John Brown at Harpers Ferry. Those strikes are hitting the ground. Those strikes are hitting trees, and fires that will be impossible to put out are being ignited all across the face of this nation. And Henry Clay, who had spent his life trying to create a compromise that would keep the Union strong, even Andrew Jackson, who was so strongly, the Union, it must and shall be preserved, he says in that 1832 speech. They've lost their power to stop what now has become, in many ways, the will of the people, and that's that it will only be resolved through conflict. So the 1850s, one of the most important decades in our US history. And I'll stop there and see if any of you have any questions or anything. And I see a question about, let's see if I can get that to pull up. Do you think Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was fictionalized or non-fictionalized? That's an excellent question, because there's been a lot written on that issue. Stowe herself had never been south of Ohio. She will say, and as a documentation, she will say, I've interviewed people who are former slaves. I have interviewed people who have visited the South, even though I haven't. So while it's almost like historical fiction, how you read a historical fiction novel and it's all based on truth, but there is this scenario created maybe with characters that are not truly historical characters. I think that's probably what Harriet Beecher Stowe would say about Uncle Tom's Cabin is maybe there wasn't an Uncle Tom, maybe there wasn't a little Eliza, but they are representative of hundreds of Uncle Toms or hundreds of little Elizas. Tim says, isn't states' rights versus federal constitutional rights the never-ending war? Oh my gosh. It is. And it's interesting because we were created as a federal system. Federalism says that there is a sovereign nation of sovereign states. And our Constitution is written such that the Ninth Amendment says all powers not given directly to the federal government by the US Constitution are retained within the states, which is why, and if you think about it real quickly, health historically is a state issue. Voting is a state issue. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that there's any federal control over voting. There's no mention of education anywhere in the US Constitution. None, nothing. So that's why when we got to the 1950s and the 1960s and the whole issues of segregation versus integration and education, you've got Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 saying separate but equal, and then you have Brown versus the board, 54 and 55, in both of those cases saying separate is inherently unequal. Why you have such an outcry? Because you have people saying, wait, education is the state's rights. Well, the argument is, and those of you within the audience may have a division of opinion on this, but it's that issue of federal rights versus states' rights still is a huge issue today. If there is something that you see occurring that appears to be a direct violation of basic inherent rights guaranteed by the Constitution, then does that mean the federal government trumps the states? Well, we didn't have a Department of Education until Jimmy Carter was elected president. It was, it used to be, you had, and let me think of how to say this correctly. In 1976, after Jimmy Carter's elected president, you have health, education, and welfare. Then that's going to be split into the Department of Education being its own federal department, and you have Health and Human Services. But prior to that, no federal involvement in education. Should the federal government be involved in education? Should there be a guarantee of equality among the level of education that students are getting in all states? I think we probably all would say yes. Everybody should have open access to education. Are there decisions that are best made at the local level? Well, of course there are. What works in Chattanooga may not be what works in Byrdstown, Tennessee. And I know I'm running over time. I don't know how we're ever going to solve that issue because of the way that we were set up as a federal system with a balance of power between, state governments and the US Constitution. By the way, the US Constitution says nothing about local government. Local government's power all rest in state legislation. Chattanooga could go out of business tomorrow. Nowhere does it say there in any constitution that there has to be local government. Hamilton County could still exist, but Chattanooga could disappear. It's kind of fascinating. It's kind of scary. It's kind of, wow, how do we answer these huge questions? And I don't know. The constitutional historian in me says, we chip away at it, we chip away at it, we chip away at it, but how do you ever satisfy all the people all the time? And I don't know. I just want us to figure it all out at some point, because I'm pretty proud of being a resident of the Republic, and I do believe in the inherent rights that we were given by the Constitution. And Christine and Jennifer, I will hush because we're at 4:34. I think I can read the clock now on the stove. So shush, Linda, shush.
Well, I was just going to make a comment for those who might not be able to see the chat, that Christina did make a comment earlier on when the slide was up showing the formation of the Republican Party with the elephant. And she commented that she did not realize the elephant was a mascot from the very beginning.
It was. And of course, from the very beginning, they were the grand old party, GOP.
Yeah.
Believing that their roots were inherent there from the very beginning. So that actually would be a fun day to look at political parties and their logos and their mascots and speeches and everything, because, the parties are constantly evolving and changing, and it's just fascinating. Love teaching that kind of history too. And I promised I'd hush.
Okay, so there's a couple good lessons, and thank you very much in there. And just wanted to mention that we will be ending in just a minute, and next week will be Forgotten Patriots.
Yes, yay!
So you can look forward to that. And with that, we're gonna wrap it up for today, and we'll see you all next week.
See you, folks.
See you.
Bye.
Thanks, Linda.
Oh, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.